Cadaver Synod, a trial beyond the grave. How vengeance, power, and the politics of the papacy led to history's most macabre tribunal. Chapter 1. Rome in the dying light of the 9th century. Rome at the end of the 9th century was a city in uneasy flux, where the once glorious empire had devolved into fractured remnants, and the papacy, an institution meant to shine as a beacon of religious authority, found itself in constant peril, manipulated by secular powers and Roman factions alike. In the city's labyrinth of narrow streets, noble families jockeyed for influence, forging and breaking alliances with brutal efficiency. Gold and blood went hand in hand. On the Tiber's western bank, the Leonine city and the Vatican complex formed the beating heart of Christendom. Pilgrims still arrived at St. Peter's tomb to pray for salvation, to glimpse the seat of the Holy Father, the Supreme Pontiff. But behind the majestic columns and towering basilicas was another Rome, one of corruption, violence, and simmering resentments. Charlemagne's empire had fractured, and the heirs of that legacy were embroiled in a constant scramble for control over northern and central Italy. On one side stood the Carolingians, or what remained of them, claiming to carry the banner of the emperors. On the other side rose powerful lords native to Italy, especially the Dukes of Spoleto, locked in an almost perpetual struggle for the imperial throne. Looming over it all was the question of who would be recognized by the Pope as the rightful emperor. The pontiff had, by the late 9th century, become not just a spiritual father, but also a kingmaker. The seat of St. Peter would pass from one pontiff to another with disturbing rapidity, ambitious men hungry for power, beset by the tides of palace intrigue. In the year 896, Formosus had been pope for 5 tumultuous years. His was a story that spanned decades, weaving in and out of exiles, accusations, and power struggles, replete with the complexities of forging alliances across the dangerous Italian peninsula. Even as many revered him as a wise and pious bishop, others scorned him as a traitor to the Spoleto cause. The animosity that had built around his papacy would long outlast his earthly life, culminating in one of the strangest and darkest trials in ecclesiastical history. But to truly appreciate the horror of the Cadaver Synod, one must understand the roiling political waters that shaped it. By 897, the papacy was a prize fought over by men who often cloaked themselves in piety while plotting murder in hidden alcoves. Bishops and aristocrats dined together at lavish Roman banquets only to dispatch assassins in the streets the following day. Factions openly battled in the Forum, and processions to the great basilicas were frequently overshadowed by the possibility of ambush. Meanwhile, peasants from the countryside would shamble into the city, their rickety carts bearing crops to be sold in the urban markets. They, too, were part of the drama, for they brought rumours from distant hills, whispers of armies stirring, of lords raising new militias, of alliances forming with the East Frankish king Arnulf, or with Guy and Lambert of Spoleto. The peasants could sense the tension in the air, but they rarely comprehended the magnitude of the intrigues swirling about them. Amid this chaos, the papal throne itself was precarious. Enemies might dethrone or poison a pope if he made the wrong alliance. Armed guards in the Lateran palace never seemed enough to safeguard the pontiff. Popes were crowned and deposed with alarming frequency, some reigning only weeks. Formosus had ascended to the See of Rome in 891, succeeding Pope Stephen VI by some count. Formosus inherited a city steeped in blood feuds, and had, in turn, made decisions that would echo with seismic force long after his own final breath. Yet no one, not even the most imaginative citizen or canny noble, could have predicted what would transpire after Formosus's death. The savage spectacle of the Cadaver Synod would become a byword for ecclesiastical scandal, a testament to how politics could contort faith into grotesque parody. disinterring a pope's body, dressing it in papal vestments, appointing a deacon to speak on the corpse's behalf. These details would remain etched in infamy. As the year 897 dawned, the city was in the throes of heartbreak and suspicion. Formosus's legacy was under siege. Unbeknownst to the people of Rome, a new pope, Stephen VI, was preparing to tear open the grave of his predecessor, to place him on trial in a manner so macabre it would shock the Christian world. Rome's ancient walls had witnessed centuries of war, plague, and sack. Yet they had never seen a trial quite like the one about to unfold. In the musty corners of Roman basilicas, the clergy nervously awaited the next papal decree. Cardinals debated in hushed voices, mindful of spies lurking in every corridor. Beyond the Tiber, the coffins of popes lay in the crypts of St. Peter's Basilica, a silent testament to the ephemeral nature of power. But soon, the boundary between death and politics would be erased. Corpses themselves would become pawns in a pitiless game for dominance. For the eternal city of Rome, the year 897 would cast a long and sinister shadow, one that would endure in ecclesiastical law for centuries. Chapter 2. The Rise of Formosus. In the early days, before he ascended to the papal throne, Formosus was simply known as a pious and astute bishop of Porto, an ancient suburb port near the mouth of the Tiber. Born around 816, the exact date lost to history, he demonstrated a keen mind for diplomacy and theology. He learned Latin and Greek with equal ease, mastering doctrinal subtleties that elevated him above many of his peers. His sermons were said to have a calm force of conviction, drawing people from miles away to listen. Long before the controversies, Formosus had been a diplomat for Pope Nicholas I and Pope Adrian II, travelling to distant courts as a papal legate. He navigated the labyrinthine politics of Bulgaria and various Frankish kingdoms. He earned respect for his measured tone, winning admiration even among those who opposed Rome's authority. Word spread that he possessed a rare combination of theological insight and worldly savvy, qualities that made him both invaluable and dangerous. Rome, however, was notoriously fickle. Formosus found himself on the losing side of a bitter papal feud during the reign of Pope John VIII. He was accused, perhaps spuriously, of aspiring to the papal throne. The charge was reminiscent of typical Roman intrigues. Whenever a figure grew too popular or influential, enemies emerged, anxious to cut him down. John VIII excommunicated Formosus, banishing him from the city. For a time, Formosus lived in uneasy exile, uncertain if he would ever return to Rome. Yet, circumstances changed quickly in the papal court. Pope John VIII met an untimely end. Some whispered he was poisoned, others suggested more violent means. John's successors came and went with unsettling rapidity. Marinus I, St. Adrian III, then Stephen VI, each ascending amid swirling rumours and ephemeral alliances. Gradually, Formosus's star rose again. He found allies who worked to lift his excommunication, and by the time Stephen V died in 891, Formosus was among the leading candidates to succeed him. In that year, the papacy faced dire threats on multiple fronts. The Holy Roman Empire was in disarray, with claims from Guido, Guy, of Spoleto, his son Lambert, and the East Frankish king, Arnulf of Carinthia. Each clamoured for recognition as emperor. Rome's aristocratic factions had their own desires, seeking a pontiff who would favour their clan, bestow lands, or confirm privileges. In this maelstrom, Formosus's reputation for statesmanship proved decisive. He was elected pope in October 891, crowned as the new Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, with the acclamations of clergy and laity, many of whom believed his steady hand might rescue them from chaos. Yet the new Pope Formosus inherited challenges that would test his diplomatic gifts to the limit. The previous pope, Stephen V, had reluctantly crowned Lambert of Spoleto as co-emperor alongside his father, Guy. Formosus now presided over a city effectively under the sway of the Spoleto family. Lambert and his formidable mother, Agiltrude, exerted pressure on the papal court, expecting loyalty in return for their patronage. Formosus, having navigated the complexities of Frankish and Bulgarian politics, recognized that tying himself too closely to Spoleto was risky. The alternative: look northward to Arnulf of Carinthia, the Carolingian claimant, who might march into Italy and break the Spoletan hold. Yet to invite a Frankish king to cross the Alps was fraught with peril. Rome's population had endured multiple invasions over the centuries, from Lombards and Franks and Saracens. The city's memories of earlier devastations lingered. No one wanted a new wave of troops rampaging through the countryside. But for Formosus, the alternative seemed grimmer. The Spoletan faction was strengthening its grip on central Italy, potentially eroding papal independence. In a landscape where the papacy depended on secular alliances to maintain any semblance of autonomy, Formosus concluded that an alliance with Arnulf might be the lesser evil. He began secret correspondences, carefully choosing emissaries to slip past watchful Spoletan eyes. In letters couched in biblical references, he hinted that the time was at hand for Arnulf to defend the Church from the tyrants who held her in bondage. Meanwhile, Pope Formosus continued the day-to-day obligations of a medieval pontiff, overseeing liturgical reforms, appointing bishops, managing Rome's defences, and refereeing the endless disputes among nobility. Despite these responsibilities, the question of how to handle the Spoletan threat loomed like an ever-present storm cloud. Formosus's stance sparked quiet fury among Spoleto's adherents in Rome. Those in the Lateran palace, who had grown accustomed to Spoletan patronage, grumbled that the Pope was turning traitor. The new bishop appointments he made were scrutinized for signs of pro-Frankish bias. Agiltrude, Lambert's mother, was an imposing figure, known for her fiery temperament and skillful manipulation of Roman politics. She was rumored to have eyes and ears everywhere. If she suspected Formosus's intrigues, the Pope might find himself facing the same fate as John VIII. Even so, Formosus pressed on, balancing between the outward show of courtesy toward the Spoletan faction and the clandestine hope he placed in Arnulf's swords. Had the political climate been stable, Formosus might have governed as a reforming pope, remembered for his administrative prowess. Instead, circumstances pushed him into the role of a survivor, forced into alliances that would define his papacy in ways that overshadowed all else. As the months turned to years, tension rose. Armies from the north tested the passes over the Alps. Rumors claimed that Arnulf was gathering support from East Francia, from Bavaria, from lords who chafed under the splintered rule of the post-Carolingian Empire. Within the walls of Rome, watchful Spoleto agents took note of every messenger leaving the papal palace. Whispers echoed in marble corridors about the Pope's secret letters, spurring suspicions of betrayal. Formosus, for his part, retreated further into a small circle of trusted advisors, clergy he believed to be loyal. Trust was a luxury in a city whose last half-dozen popes had either died under suspicious circumstances or departed under a cloud of rumors. Still, Formosus advanced his strategy, confident, or at least hoping, that deliverance would arrive before it was too late. Little did he know that his mortal life would not outlast the tumult. Nor could he imagine the humiliations that would be heaped upon his body in the aftermath. For now, he was the reigning pope, respected by many, distrusted by others, but still living. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next chapter in the unending struggle between its temporal and spiritual lords. Chapter 3 of Spoletans and Carolingians. The year was 893 when Arnulf of Carinthia, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a warrior, first received clandestine envoys from Rome in his palace at Regensburg. According to later annals, these envoys carried private letters from Pope Formosus, calling upon Arnulf to liberate the Eternal City. Arnulf's court seethed with tension. Some of his nobles were eager for expansion into Italy. Wealth and prestige beckoned. Others feared the logistical nightmare of crossing the Alps against the combined might of the Spolitan armies. Yet Arnulf himself had an undeniable claim, as he was a grandson of the mighty Louis the German, a line that linked back to Charlemagne. If the Pope offered imperial coronation, how could Arnulf resist? The throne of a restored Holy Roman Empire, complete with its seat in Rome, was a temptation almost impossible to ignore. In quiet halls illuminated by flickering torchlight, Arnulf deliberated with his advisors. Taking up the Pope's invitation meant risking men and resources, but the prize was incalculable, the legitimizing hand of St. Peter's successor upon his head. Back in Rome, the threat from the Spolitan faction was tangible. Guy of Spoleto died in late 894, leaving Lambert, his young son, as the new figurehead. But the real power behind the Spolitan cause was Agiltrude, Guy's widow and Lambert's formidable mother. A Lombard princess by birth, she wielded the art of political maneuvering like a well-honed sword. Upon her husband's death, she rushed to Rome to ensure Lambert's coronation was honored and recognized by Pope Formosus. She expected the Pope to reaffirm her son's claim to the imperial crown. Formosus, fearing immediate reprisal if he refused, felt compelled to comply. Yet with a cunning that belied his clerical garb, he continued to encourage Arnulf to press forward. It was a game of delay and dissimulation. Late in 895, the game reached a climax. Arnulf crossed the Alps with a sizable army, ignoring the early winter snows. He moved swiftly, capturing cities in northern Italy with minimal resistance, for the Spolitan ranks were neither well organized nor well led at that moment. Lambert himself was still little more than a youth, and many of his father's supporters switched allegiance at the sight of Arnulf's disciplined cavalry. In Rome, chaos ensued. Agiltrude attempted to rally defenders, but the city's gates stood open to Arnulf. She had no choice but to flee with Lambert to the fortified stronghold of Spoleto. On a crisp April day in 896, Arnulf entered Rome. The dusty hush of the city gave way to the thunder of hooves and marching feet, but any illusions of a grand triumph were marred by the brooding tension among the Roman populace. They watched from behind windows and doorways, uncertain whether these foreign soldiers were friend or foe. Pope Formosus, at last, had the ally he'd long desired. In St. Peter's Basilica, amid solemn chants, he placed the imperial crown upon Arnulf's head, recognizing him as Holy Roman Emperor. For a moment, it seemed like the city might stabilize under this new order, yet the uneasy calm would be short-lived. Arnulf had no intention of tarrying in Rome. He was determined to stamp out Spoleto's resistance. Rumor had it that Agiltrude, her son Lambert, and their supporters were regrouping outside the city. Not long after his imperial coronation, Arnulf led a contingent of troops out of Rome, setting his sights on the Spolitan heartland. Some accounts suggest that Arnulf had begun to suffer a mysterious ailment, perhaps a stroke or debilitating fever, which would soon hamper his military ambitions. Whatever its nature, it struck at the worst possible moment. By the time Arnulf reached Spoleto, his condition had worsened. He had to withdraw north to regroup. In the vacuum left behind, Pope Formosus found himself vulnerable. Rome, still roiling with factions, looked upon him with mixed emotions. The German army had liberated the city from Spolitan dominance, but the new emperor was now absent, possibly incapacitated. Formosus's health, too, was deteriorating. He had lived through excommunications, diplomacy, threats, and the burdens of the papacy. The weight of constant vigilance took its toll. Whispers grew that the Pope had fallen gravely ill. He would die in April of 896, mere weeks after crowning Arnulf. Rumours circulated that it was poison administered by Spolitan loyalists, though official accounts labelled it a natural death. Hardly unusual in an era where the average lifespan was short, especially for a beleaguered pontiff in the midst of political crosswinds. Whatever the truth, Formosus's passing left the papal throne again in question. Those who had feasted on his patronage lamented. Those who despised him, and there were many, saw an opportunity for retribution. The ephemeral reign of Boniface VI followed. Lasting only 15 days, Boniface's pontificate ended abruptly. Again, cause of death unknown, speculation rampant. Rome was a city fed by rumors, and the swirl around Boniface's demise did not surprise anyone. The subsequent papal election put Stephen VI on the throne, a man with a checkered background but a cunning mind. In the immediate aftermath of Formosus's death, few could guess that Stephen, the new pope, would orchestrate one of the most bizarre episodes in church history. Yet the seeds had been planted during Formosus's turbulent reign. The alliances with Arnulf, the overshadowed crowning of Lambert, and the simmering anger of Agiltrude created the perfect environment for a vindictive response. Formosus, ironically, was beyond earthly suffering, his body entombed among other pontiffs. But the wrath of his enemies knew no such restraint. The stage was set for a trial the likes of which the world had never seen. A dead pope would stand accused in an ecclesiastical court. Chapter 4. A City on Edge. When Pope Stephen VI assumed the papal mantle in the summer of 896, Rome was teetering on the precipice. Armies had come and gone. Plague and famine lurked at the edges of the Italian countryside, and the city's moral and social fabric was frayed. The arrival of each new pope brought both hope and dread to the populace. Stephen VI was no different. To some, he was simply another puppet, enthroned by the powerful families that controlled Rome. To others, he was a devout cleric who might bring stability. Few could divine his true intentions. Stephen had been consecrated Bishop of Anagni at some point before his papacy. Under what circumstances he had forged alliances with the Spolitan faction is unclear, but it was widely believed that Agiltrude and Lambert, regrouping after Arnulf's retreat, sought to use him as a means of punishing the memory of Formosus. The newly enthroned Stephen bore a mixture of resentments and political debts. He had likely been close to factions who felt betrayed by Formosus's invitation to the Franks, or perhaps he simply saw an opportunity to consolidate power in a city that devoured the weak-willed. Word began to circulate among the Roman clergy that Stephen harbored an intense hatred for Formosus. Some pinned it on personal ambition. Once, it was rumored, Stephen had been overshadowed by Formosus in ecclesiastical preferments. Others said Stephen was merely a conduit for Agiltrude's fury, that she demanded the condemnation of the dead pope to legitimize Lambert's claim to the imperial throne. If Formosus's decrees, including Arnulf's crowning, were declared invalid, then Lambert would remain the undisputed emperor in the eyes of Rome. In the taverns near the Forum, the talk was less refined. "They say he'll dig up the old pope's bones," one soldier jested to another. "He's got no shame." Laughter would follow such jests, but there was a nervous undertone. Pope Formosus still had admirers in the city, especially among those who hated the Spolitans. It wasn't wise to speak too loudly against a living or dead pontiff in front of the wrong crowd. During processions, Stephen VI rode in a ceremonial litter, accepting homage from the Roman nobles. He feigned magnanimity, but tension lingered in every gesture. The laity noticed subtle changes: the presence of new guards in the papal palace, rumoured to be loyal to the Spolitan cause. Some cardinals and bishops who had supported Formosus were quietly reassigned, pressured into silence, or even intimidated into leaving Rome. The stage was being set meticulously, though few realized to what extreme it would escalate. When an announcement finally came that a synod was to be convened to address the crimes of Pope Formosus, the city buzzed with gossip and alarm. Could the Pope be tried posthumously? It seemed unthinkable. Church tradition forbade passing judgment on the dead. Indeed, once a man was gone, it was believed God's tribunal held final authority. Yet Stephen VI, brandishing legalistic arguments, insisted that Formosus had violated canon law even before his papacy, thereby invalidating his election to the See of Rome. If those violations were proven, everything Formosus had decreed, ordinations, appointments, the crowning of Arnulf, could be declared null. A sense of impending dread settled over the clergy. Even those who had disliked Formosus felt a profound discomfort. True, popes in the past had excommunicated each other. Some had declared the actions of their predecessors invalid, but to drag a rotting corpse into a courtroom, that rumor seemed more akin to a tale from pagan times, unworthy of the Christian Church. Yet whispers grew more persistent, until it became widely believed that Stephen VI intended to exhume Formosus's body and present it before a tribunal of bishops. In the quiet hush of monastic libraries, scribes paused in their work. Can the new pope truly be planning such a sacrilege? They wondered. The few who dared to question the plan publicly were silenced. Some were imprisoned or forced into hiding. Under the veiled threat of violence, the Roman clergy mostly complied, preparing for the synod as commanded. Meanwhile, outside the city walls, roving bands of mercenaries lurked. Italy was still unsettled. The spoils of war beckoned. Among the common folk, prayers became more desperate. They asked the saints to protect them from the swirl of events they could neither influence nor fully comprehend. Priests in rural chapels preached about Christian charity, but their voices often trembled. They had heard the rumors too. By the end of 896, the ecclesiastical machinery was in motion for what Pope Stephen VI called a just and necessary examination of Formosus's pontificate. The rosters of bishops attending were drawn up. Letters were sent to distant sees, commanding attendance or procuring statements of condemnation. The authority of the papal curia, combined with the intimidation factor of Spoletan lords, made refusal almost impossible. And so the city braced itself. In the Roman Forum, the broken columns of the ancient empire stood as silent witnesses to the new empire's tribulations. On the Palatine Hill, aristocratic mansions flung open their courtyards for secret gatherings, where the name Formosus was whispered in fear or scorn. Down the Tiber, merchant ships unloaded goods from the east and from Gaul, their crews eager to depart a city that felt cursed by political storms. In January of 897, the synod gathered in earnest. Bishops, deacons, priests, and lay representatives crowded into the Basilica of St. John Lateran, Rome's cathedral, and the traditional seat of the Pope. The structure, grand yet dark, seemed weighed down by centuries of history. Its columns and arches had seen coronations and funerals, anointings and excommunications. Now they would bear witness to something utterly unprecedented, a trial with a defendant who had been buried, only to be brought forth from his eternal rest to face earthly charges once more. Chapter 5. The Exhumation. Shortly before the trial began, an unsettling procession made its way through the hushed corridors of St. Peter's. A group of lesser clerics, accompanied by armed guards, approached the tomb where Pope Formosus had been laid to rest just months earlier. By many accounts, the hour was late, the basilica lit only by torches that flickered against the mosaics on the walls. Within the tomb, Formosus's corpse, still clad in decaying vestments, was disturbed from its final repose. The smell, rancid and gut-wrenching, nauseated those in attendance. Some reeled back, pressing cloth to their faces. But the papal guards, stern-faced, insisted on carrying out their orders. These men had no particular reverence for the deceased pope. They served whoever wielded power. One by one, they lifted the rotting remains of Formosus from the stone sarcophagus, handling them with a mixture of revulsion and forced efficiency. A hush, broken only by murmured prayers and muttered curses, hung in the air. Outside, the city slept fitfully. A handful of curious onlookers gathered near the basilica, glimpsing shadows moving through torchlight in the courtyard. No official announcement had yet been made that the body would be present at the synod. Still, rumors suggested something terrible was afoot. Soldiers at the gates barred entry to those who tried to approach. Inside, the small retinue continued its grim work. They placed the corpse on a stretcher-like contrivance. According to some later accounts, exaggerated though they may be, Formosus's skeletal features were still recognizable, the papal ring glinting on a blackened finger. Vestments, though decayed, clung to the remains as if defying the indignity of the moment. A few lesser deacons gagged or turned away. They were not trained for such monstrous tasks. Yet, under Stephen VI's order, they carried on. The abomination, as some quietly labelled it, would serve its political purpose. Under cloak of darkness, they carried Formosus's remains through the city streets to the Lateran Palace, seat of the Pope and site of the forthcoming synod. Some versions of the story claim that passers-by, awakened by the torchlight or the clank of soldiers, peered out from windows, crossing themselves in shock. It must have been a sight out of nightmares. An entourage bearing a decomposed corpse, draped in what remained of pontifical robes, stumbling over cobblestones en route to a trial. Whether Stephen VI supervised this exhumation personally remains a matter of debate. Most likely, he awaited the corpse's arrival in the palace, preparing for the theatrical and terrifying display he had orchestrated. The Pope seemed driven by a specific malice or by an equally potent fear of the Spolitan faction that demanded Formosus's condemnation. Whatever his personal motive, Stephen VI knew that this grotesque spectacle would send a message. The memory of Formosus was to be utterly disgraced. In a side chamber of the Lateran complex, the body was dressed more carefully to make it presentable. A mocking vestment was arranged on the rotting flesh. Someone even attempted to straighten the papal tiara, or possibly a simpler mitre, on the corpse's skull. The effect was profoundly unsettling. Formosus, once revered by many, was now a grotesque puppet in a show. A hush filled the chamber as the final preparations were made. No one spoke of the sinfulness of such an act. Few dared question the papal command. Night gave way to dawn, and the time for the synod approached. The Basilica of St. John Lateran was filled with attendees. Bishops who had travelled from across Italy, under pressure from Stephen VI, took their seats in the dimly lit interior. The mosaic of Christ above the apse bore silent witness to the lines of anxious clerics. Murmurs of discontent mingled with dread curiosity. There was a sense that they stood on the cusp of an unprecedented sacrilege, yet fear of defying Stephen VI, and by extension the Spolitan lords, silenced many. Finally, the retinue arrived bearing Formosus's cadaver, propping it up on a throne in the centre of the synod hall. Gasps and cries of revulsion rippled through the assembly. Never in living memory had a pope's body been used as a spectacle in such a manner. Some bishops covered their faces, while others stared in horrified fascination. The cadaver sat crookedly, a macabre figure in papal regalia, the jaw hanging slightly ajar. Empty sockets where eyes had once looked upon the faithful. Those nearest the corpse reported the sickly stench of death enveloping them. Pope Stephen VI, resplendent in his own vestments, took his seat upon a raised dais. He cast an imperious gaze across the congregation. It was said his eyes burned with a mix of triumph and desperation, for this moment would seal his fate as much as it would seal Formosus's condemnation. Flanking Stephen were a handful of bishops, whose expressions ranged from morbid awe to servile compliance. Many recognized that to oppose this trial publicly could be tantamount to a death sentence. Thus began the unholy event that would pass into history as the Cadaver Synod. In the hush that followed the unveiling of the dead Pope, Stephen VI rose to begin the formal accusations. That the accused was incapable of speech, in fact, incapable of anything, appeared not to matter. In a twisted parody of canonical procedure, Stephen appointed a deacon to speak for Formosus. The entire assembly braced for the next step, which would fling the church into an enduring scandal. Chapter 6. The opening of the Cadaver Synod. Pope Stephen VI stood before the congregation, a figure both solemn and furious, prepared to launch into a litany of accusations. Those present, the Roman clergy, bishops from near and far, even members of the Roman aristocracy, sat transfixed by the gruesome spectacle. Formosus's corpse, slumped on its makeshift throne, cast an eerie presence over the proceedings. The basilica was dimly lit by torches and high windows that let in a wan winter light. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by the shifting of feet and the rustling of robes. In the front rows, the cardinal bishops exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers spread through the gathered synod. How can we even hold a trial with a corpse? This is sacrilege. We must not defy the Pope. At last, Stephen VI raised his voice. Accounts of the actual wording differ, but all agree on the charges. Formosus had supposedly violated canon law by receiving the bishopric of Rome while already holding the bishopric of Porto. He was accused of perjury, of coveting the papacy, of performing functions as bishop when he should have been laicized. Above all, the underlying reason for the trial was political: to annul the acts of Formosus, especially those relating to emperor-making. If the synod condemned him, Arnulf's coronation might be deemed invalid, handing victory to the Spoletan faction. "Answer me, Formosus!" Stephen VI's voice resounded in the basilica. He gestured theatrically toward the rotting cadaver. A wave of nervous laughter rippled through some at the back. Others grimaced in revulsion. Then came the strangest moment. A trembling young deacon, assigned as the defender of Formosus, stood at the corpse's side. The deacon, his face ashen, tried to speak softly for the dead pope. In halting Latin, he attempted to deny the charges. The entire scene bordered on the grotesque. Bishops who despised Formosus found themselves torn between political expediency and the deeply ingrained reverence for the office of the Pope. A few present, historians believe, nearly walked out, but Stephen VI's furious glare pinned them in place. Outside, squads of armed men loyal to the Spoletan cause ensured that dissenters would pay a high price. Consequently, a terrible hush prevailed. Stephen presented documents, some legitimate, some possibly forged, that portrayed Formosus as a schemer. He recounted the excommunication under John VIII, conveniently omitting that Formosus had been reinstated later. Step by step, Stephen built a case that Formosus had never been canonically eligible to assume the papacy. Because of that, everything Formosus had done was null and void. "Tell this assembly, traitor," Stephen's voice echoed again, addressing the corpse as though it might respond. "Did you not conspire to ascend the papal throne unlawfully? Did you not call the invader Arnulf into Italy, defying the rightful Emperor Lambert?" The deacon, shaking, managed a few words. On behalf of Pope Formosus, I deny these charges. But his voice was almost lost in the enormity of the cathedral. The crowd muttered, some too horrified to speak, others glaring at the spectacle with grim satisfaction. Formosus's corpse, of course, provided no reaction. It sat, head lolling to the side. At times, it seemed the entire assembly was slipping into a nightmarish delirium. Here was a man who had once led them in prayers, who had crowned a king in that very city, now disinterred to face condemnation. The stench of decay intensified under the basilica's heat, forcing some participants to stifle coughs or press perfumes to their nostrils. Stephen, carried by the fervor of his oration, pressed on. He demanded witnesses. A few lesser clerics, likely coerced or bribed, stepped forward to testify that Formosus had indeed broken canon law. They offered meandering accounts, pointing to the old excommunications and rumors that Formosus had tried to desert his bishopric in Porto. Their testimonies were riddled with contradiction, but no one dared to challenge them outright. The tension in the hall rose to a fever pitch when Stephen called for a verdict. The trial had been little more than a choreographed condemnation from the start, yet to watch it unfold was something else entirely. The bishops looked among themselves, some pale with fear, some cast in a stoic acceptance of the farce. They knew how they were expected to vote. One by one, they nodded assent. Few dared risk the fury of Pope Stephen VI or the retribution of the Spoletan faction that hovered menacingly beyond Rome's walls. The synod was moving with unstoppable momentum toward a damning sentence. As the final statements were made, Stephen's voice quivered with righteous rage, or something akin to it. "We find this dead man guilty," he declared, "of perjury, of violating the sacred canons, of coveting the papacy by foul means." With a sweeping gesture, he pointed to the cadaver. "His punishment shall be the stripping of every dignity bestowed upon him. His acts are hereby annulled. Everything he performed as bishop or pope is void." The watchers breathed uneasily. One might think the ordeal would end there, but Stephen had planned more. In an act that would become infamous, he ordered the papal vestments to be torn from Formosus's corpse. Clerics stepped forward to remove the garments that symbolized Formosus's holy office. The ring, which a bishop wore as a symbol of his nuptial bond with the church, was yanked from the decaying finger with a sickening squelch. And in a moment that seemed to define the entire spectacle's cruelty, the two fingers of blessing on Formosus's right hand, those used by bishops to confer blessings, were cut off and cast aside. An audible gasp echoed in the basilica. Even for those who wanted Formosus condemned, it was a horrifying sight. The physical desecration of the corpse, the brutality of it, stunned everyone. Pope Stephen VI, once a peripheral figure in the chaos of Rome, was now enacting a punishment so extreme that its memory would haunt the Church for centuries. Thus ended the formal portion of the Cadaver Synod's trial. The sentence was declared. All ordinations performed by Formosus were invalid. All appointments he had made were undone, and the man himself, in death, was denounced as an illegal intruder onto the papal throne. But the tragedy did not end there. Soon, Stephen would order the body cast into the Tiber, erasing all semblance of Christian burial. Before that final step, though, the congregation dispersed in shock, many with tears of horror, others with grim satisfaction, and still others carrying the seeds of rebellion in their hearts. The city's darkest hour had just begun. Chapter 7. Aftermath and Outrage. In the days immediately following the synod, the battered remains of Pope Formosus were unceremoniously dragged through the streets of Rome. At some point, the body, stripped of its papal raiment, was dumped into a common grave. According to later sources, Stephen VI was not satisfied even with this. The stories diverge. Some say the corpse was again unearthed by local zealots, while others maintain the Pope ordered it pulled out for a final act of desecration. Ultimately, the cadaver was hurled into the Tiber River. That murky water, flowing inexorably to the sea, had swallowed many a victim of Rome's cruelty, but few as infamous as a once reigning pontiff. Shockwaves from the Cadaver Synod rumbled through the city. Some Romans were revolted that the seat of St. Peter had become a stage for such macabre theatrics. They whispered that Stephen VI was either mad or possessed by demonic fury. Rumors circulated that in the late hours, Stephen suffered night terrors, haunted by the figure of Formosus rising from the Tiber to exact revenge. Within weeks, word of the synod spread beyond Rome. Bishops and princes from across Italy and beyond wrote letters expressing horror. Some, especially those aligned with the Spolitan faction, praised Stephen's verdict as a righteous condemnation of a usurper. But many more saw it as an abomination. Even those who had disliked Formosus felt that exhuming and mutilating his corpse violated the most basic tenets of Christian charity and respect for the dead. Clerical communities braced themselves for the possibility that the outcome of the trial would overturn their ordinations if Formosus had been the one to confer them. This introduced theological chaos. Entire dioceses might suddenly lack valid clergy. Agiltrude and Lambert, at first, exulted in the news. Formosus's condemnation theoretically nullified Arnulf's coronation. Yet their triumph was tempered by the disturbing accounts of how Stephen VI had conducted the trial. It was not exactly a moment of moral high ground. Still, the Spolitan mother and son believed the synod served their immediate interests. Lambert was still the rightful emperor, and no acts of Formosus stood in his way. However, the immediate impact on the Roman populace proved explosive. Pope Stephen VI, by so flagrantly crossing moral lines, ignited fierce opposition. Riots simmered in the poorer districts. The taverns echoed with fury. The people raged that a city that once prided itself on Christian piety had turned into a place of necromantic spectacle. Some believed a curse would fall upon Rome. Others argued it was already here, pointing to the famine and disease that lurked at the city's edges. Clergy, who had once wavered in their loyalty to Formosus, now found themselves outraged by the synod's brutality. In secret corners of the city, small groups conspired to overthrow Stephen VI. With Arnulf incapacitated in the north, they lacked the immediate military support to make an open rebellion. But the seeds of resistance were planted nonetheless. Allies of Formosus, though they had ducked low during his condemnation, began quietly coordinating. As a sign of the city's despair, even the Tiber seemed to play a part in the unfolding drama. According to legends that would flower in later centuries, Formosus's body, though weighed down by water, washed ashore along the riverbank. Some said it was discovered by a monk who recognized it by the remains of the severed fingers, who then ensured it was buried properly. These stories, possibly apocryphal, underscored the popular sentiment that Formosus's dishonored corpse could not rest until a measure of justice was done. Stephen VI, aware of the growing unrest, strengthened his hold on the city. He increased the presence of Spolitan or papal guards, stationed them at strategic points around the Lateran Palace and the basilicas. He forbade public gatherings of priests without approval, effectively stifling open dissent. Nevertheless, clandestine plots took form, stoked by the fury over the Cadaver Synod. Hatred for Stephen VI festered in the streets. The newly minted clergy who had been ordained by Stephen himself found their status precarious. If another pope rose and reversed Stephen's condemnation of Formosus, might Stephen's own acts be declared invalid in turn? The swirl of uncertainty affected not only the spiritual realm, but day-to-day governance. Bishops questioned the validity of the appointments Formosus had made. local parishes weren't sure if their priests were truly anointed. Tensions simmered in countless communities across the peninsula. While the synod had aimed to unify the Church under a pro-Spoletan narrative, it instead sowed deeper discord and confusion. Rome's restless nights were pierced by occasional street brawls. They were not large-scale riots, yet, but the atmosphere was charged with the possibility of open violence. It was only a matter of time before the anger unleashed itself on Stephen VI. The Pope, doubling down on his authority, ordered public pronouncements affirming the condemnation of Formosus, insisting that the city's clergy renounce their loyalty to the deceased pontiff. Many complied outwardly, but seethed in secret. Thus, the stage was set for a bloody denouement. While the Church reeled under the weight of its own scandal, political powers regrouped. Lambert of Spoleto was still recognized by Stephen VI as emperor. But in the swirling chaos of the times, no one's position was secure for long. Lambert, Agiltrude, Arnulf, and other regional lords viewed Rome's internal strife as an opportunity to solidify or renegotiate their power. Within the city's walls, the hush before the storm lingered. Citizens avoided the papal palace unless summoned. The corridors of the Lateran, which once hummed with bureaucratic activity, were now corridors of dread. Stephen VI might hold the papal throne, but it was an uneasy seat, overshadowed by the spectre of the dead pope, whose name, Formosus, meaning handsome in Latin, now evoked thoughts of decayed flesh and severed fingers. Rarely in the Church's history had a posthumous feud unleashed such dark passions. Rome prepared for the next upheaval, uncertain whether redemption or further ruin lay ahead. Chapter 8. Seeds of Revolt. As weeks turned into months following the Cadaver Synod, Pope Stephen VI found himself ensnared in a web of fear and paranoia. Rome's streets were no longer safe for him to walk freely. Not that popes often walked the streets unguarded, but now the tension was thicker than ever. Rumors of plots and assassination attempts swirled around the Lateran palace. Voices in the night whispered that any day the populace might storm the palace and demand the Pope's head. Part of Stephen's vulnerability stemmed from his heavy-handed tactics. He had alienated significant factions within the clergy, who regarded the Cadaver Synod as both illegal and morally obscene. Bishops who had once remained silent about the condemnation of Formosus began to voice subtle objections. Some refused to accept that all Formosus's ordinations were invalid, as it would strip many priests and bishops of their offices and create chaos across Italy's dioceses. The unity of the Church was at risk. In an effort to placate these critics, Stephen VI tried to blame the more extreme elements of the synod on the demands of the Spoletan faction. In private audiences, he confided to select cardinals that he had been compelled by others to conduct the trial. Yet no one truly believed that Stephen himself had not relished humiliating Formosus. His vanity and envy had shone through his every action, and it was far too late for disclaimers. The deed was done, the scandal unleashed. Among the laity, especially the lower classes, anger burned even brighter. The city's poor often believed that the desecration of Formosus's body had incurred God's wrath. Superstitions multiplied, ill omens in the sky, bizarre dreams, a plague of rats in certain neighborhoods. Mothers crossing the Tiber with baskets of laundry glimpsed shapes in the water, half convinced it was the restless spirit of the dead pope. Exaggerated? Surely. But such folklore fed the city's sense of impending doom. Organized opposition slowly took form in the shape of underground cells. Some were led by minor clerics outraged by the synod, others by middle-ranking nobles who had grown disillusioned with Stephen VI's heavy hand. They communicated through coded letters, meeting in hidden chapels after dark. Their goals varied. Some demanded Stephen's resignation or removal. Others only wanted a retraction of the condemnation of Formosus. but they were united by hatred for the man who had violated the sanctity of the church. Despite the hush that shrouded these clandestine gatherings, whispers reached Stephen's ears through spies and informants. Each new rumor of conspiracy heightened his paranoia. He ordered more arrests, torturing a handful of priests to extract confessions about potential uprisings. This brutality, predictably, fanned the flames of rebellion. The Roman people, even those who had once been indifferent, saw the Pope's oppressive tactics and recoiled. Tensions soared. Outside Rome, the political climate remained equally unstable. Lambert of Spoleto, though recognized by Stephen VI, faced challenges consolidating power in other parts of Italy. Arnulf had retreated north, but was still a threat in name, if not in immediate military presence. Nobles like the Margraves of Tuscany or Friuli weighed their options in the broader game of imperial politics. Rome, at the center, was ripe for upheaval. A shift in local power could ripple across the peninsula. One late summer evening, a gathering of discontented clergy met in a crumbling chapel dedicated to Saint Sebastian, far from the main thoroughfares. Lit by the glow of a single lantern, they confessed their fears to one another. A cardinal, older and soft-spoken, voiced what many felt. This city bleeds under an impious shepherd. Stephen has defiled the body of a pope, set a precedent of terror. The fear of God's punishment weighs upon us. A younger priest, eyes burning with righteous anger, responded, "Then we must act. If no one else in Christendom will stop him, Rome's own people must." At these words, murmured assent spread through the small assembly. They discussed alliances with certain Roman noble houses who had turned against Stephen. Families that might rally armed men in the event of an uprising. Should the day come when the Pope was overthrown, they would secure the city's gates, ensuring no Spoletan force could enter. Such was the fervor brewing beneath the surface of daily life in Rome. Street vendors sold bread and vegetables in the markets, pilgrims visited relics, stonemasons repaired walls, and all the while, the rumor of revolt grew. The city's faces betrayed little outward sign of rebellion, but the atmosphere was charged, as if every Roman could sense that a storm was about to break. Stephen VI, for his part, tried to project an image of confidence. He held liturgical processions with extravagant pomp. Surrounded by armed guards, he paraded relics of saints through the streets, as if to remind the populace that he alone held spiritual authority. In his homilies, delivered in the Lateran, he lambasted the memory of Formosus with renewed vigor, calling him a liar and usurper. Each invective garnered fewer amens. Many worshippers bowed their heads, either in fear or silent dissent. The Pope also dispatched envoys to Lambert and Agiltrude, pleading for them to send reinforcements to secure the papal throne. He argued that the city was rife with traitors, that a coup was imminent. Yet Lambert's resources were stretched thin, and rumors of the young emperor's indecision circulated. Perhaps the Spoletans thought Stephen had served his purpose. Maybe they hesitated to stake more troops in a city that increasingly loathed its pontiff. For the moment, at least, the Pope faced his enemies largely alone. Thus the tension escalated, day by day. A single spark was all it would take to ignite violence. Few realized that the spark would come from the lesser quarters of the city, among the ranks of impoverished Romans whose outraged faith and desperate living conditions could no longer abide Stephen's tyranny. The hour of reckoning approached. The memory of Formosus, far from lying quiet in the Tiber's depths, seemed to swirl through the back streets of Rome, fueling the sense that an unholy travesty demanded retribution. Chapter 9. The Uprising. In the early autumn of 897, discontent erupted into open violence. Accounts differ as to the exact trigger. Some chronicles mention a humiliating public penance Stephen VI tried to impose on priests ordained by Formosus, demanding they relinquish any sacramental authority. Others describe new tax levies the Pope mandated to fund a private militia. Whatever the final impetus, the spark found its tinder. Crowds gathered in the main market near the ruins of the ancient Forum. Bakers, fishmongers, and humble artisans who heard rumors of new papal decrees fanned each other's outrage. A few bold voices shouted, "Down with the bishop who curses the dead!" Others invoked the name of Formosus, pleading for divine vengeance upon his desecrators. As the throng grew in number, they marched toward the Lateran palace, brandishing makeshift weapons, clubs, staffs, iron rods. Word spread swiftly through the city's narrow lanes. Men, women, and even children joined the swelling mob. The city guard, uncertain of whether to suppress them or step aside, largely melted away, reluctant to shed Roman blood in defense of a hated pope. The movement was not a well-organized insurrection, but its energy was unstoppable. Priests who had harbored resentment against Stephen VI found themselves emboldened to join the wave of protest. Some clutched crucifixes, others brandished torches. They cried, "Justice for Formosus!" and "Deliver us, O Lord, from the tyrant!" When the crowd reached the Lateran, they found the gates barred. Guards on the ramparts hesitated, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. The fortress-like palace was formidable, but the anger of the crowd was equally formidable. Stones were hurled, and the gates were battered with improvised rams. Inside, Stephen VI hurriedly donned papal vestments, believing that confronting the mob in full regalia might remind them of his holy office. But as the gates began to buckle, panic swept through the Pope's entourage. At last, the gates collapsed, and the crowd flooded into the courtyard. Some accounts suggest that the Pope attempted to address them from a high balcony, proclaiming his innocence and divine right. But the mob roared back in fury, hurling insults. The once imposing Stephen VI now seemed small and frightened. His support among the nobility had dissipated, and no cavalry arrived from the Spolitans. Surrounded by an ocean of furious Romans, the pontifical guard either surrendered or vanished. The moment of confrontation came swiftly. A group of rebel clerics, still wearing their vestments, cornered Stephen in a corridor near the basilica's entrance. One witness described how the Pope, trembling, tried to invoke the name of St. Peter, but his voice was drowned by the accusations of sacrilege. He was seized, stripped of his papal robes, and locked in a dark cell within the palace complex, under heavy guard. Word of Stephen's capture spread like wildfire. The city erupted in a grim sort of celebration. People shouted and sang hymns in the streets, as though a deliverance had come. Yet the chaos did not subside at once. Looting broke out, with factions settling old scores. Some believed the entire Roman aristocracy was complicit in Stephen's crimes. The turmoil threatened to tear the city apart. But from within the ranks of the more respectable clergy, cooler heads emerged. They pressed for a formal imprisonment and trial of Stephen VI rather than a lynching. Even in an age of violence, some still believed in maintaining a veneer of ecclesiastical justice. And so the Pope languished in a cell, guarded by men who owed loyalty not to him, but to a new cause, the reclamation of the Church's dignity. As the dust settled, the question of who would take Stephen's place loomed. The name of Formosus was on many lips. If only his spirit could guide us, some whispered. A consensus emerged that the synod's condemnation of Formosus was a heresy. They would need a new pope who would restore order and repudiate the CADAVER synod. Yet such transitional moments can be perilous. Without a recognized authority, various factions might vie for control, leading to a renewed cycle of bloodshed. The partisans of Formosus and the moderate clergy understood they must act decisively. They needed a candidate who could unite the city and quell further unrest. As a caretaker, they selected a figure from among the remaining senior clergy, someone who had kept a low profile during Stephen's reign, but was widely respected. Meanwhile, locked in the darkness of his prison cell, Stephen VI awaited his fate. He was guarded day and night, his every plea for release ignored. Food and water were given sparingly. Some claimed he raved about hearing Formosus's voice echo in the cell, tormenting him. Whether that was a rumor spread by the jailers or a sign of genuine madness, no one could say. The Pope, who had gone to such lengths to degrade his predecessor, was now reduced to pitiful solitude, suffering the weight of his own misdeeds. For the citizens of Rome, the immediate threat was quelled. The man who had orchestrated the greatest sacrilege in the Church's memory was behind bars. Yet the city was far from at peace. Factions debated the next steps for spiritual and temporal governance. Diplomatic envoys scrambled to reassure regional powers that order would soon be restored. Through it all, one lesson stood starkly. The memory of Formosus would not be so easily erased, and any attempt to do so would risk the same fate that befell Pope Stephen VI. Chapter 10. The Downfall of Stephen VI. Stephen VI lingered in captivity for several weeks. The environment was harsh: damp stone walls, a straw pallet, and a single sputtering lamp. His keepers were mostly low-ranking guards who had once bent the knee to him, but who now eyed him with contempt. There was no formal trial. The fervor of the uprising had demanded immediate consequences. While some clerics suggested that he might one day stand before a tribunal of bishops to answer for the Cadaver Synod, the city's mood allowed little room for patience. A pivotal moment came one night when a small clique of jailers, fueled by a mixture of vengeance and drink, decided to act on their own. They whispered among themselves that Stephen VI did not deserve the dignity of a trial, nor the risk that some powerful faction might intervene to rescue him. In the dim torchlight of the prison corridors, they concluded that Stephen's life must end, quietly and swiftly. They entered his cell. Accounts are murky, but most historians conclude that Stephen VI was strangled. Some say the Pope tried to fight back, while others describe him as weak and delirious from his confinement. Whichever way it happened, the man who had once boldly exhumed and judged his predecessor now faced a form of vigilante justice. No trial, no final blessing. Just a silent murder in the darkness beneath the Lateran. News of Stephen's death spread by morning. Many Romans greeted it with grim acceptance. Some saw it as divine punishment visited upon a sinner who had crossed every boundary of decency and sanctity. Others were relieved that the threat of his return to power was gone. Still, even among those who reviled him, a flicker of horror remained. The city had become a place of corpses, first Formosus, now Stephen. Who would be next? With the papal throne vacant yet again, the factions in Rome scrambled to reorganize. In a matter of months, two more popes, Romanus and Theodore II, would succeed Stephen VI, each reigning for brief periods. Both of these pontiffs sought to undo the ramifications of the Cadaver Synod. Pope Romanus initially tried to restore harmony, though little is documented about his short rule. Theodore II, who lasted barely 3 weeks in the See of Peter, declared the acts of Stephen VI invalid and returned dignity to those ordained by Formosus. He also oversaw the recovery and reburial of Formosus's body, confirming the rumor that the cadaver had indeed been retrieved from the Tiber. The faithful saw this act as a step towards spiritual healing for a city that had marred itself with unspeakable deeds. But the chain of short papal reigns was not yet over. Within the span of a single year, Rome witnessed a rapid turnover in leadership. As each new pope came to power, the condemnation of the Cadaver Synod became more emphatic. Formosus's reputation, though still polarizing, saw a resurgence of sympathy from the clergy and laity alike. Tales of his piety contrasted starkly with the vilification Stephen VI had attempted. For common Romans, life continued amid the political storms. The markets reopened, peasants came in from the countryside to sell produce, pilgrims trickled back to see the revered shrines. Yet a shadow lingered. The city's people had seen how far political vendettas could corrupt the highest spiritual office. Whispers spread that the entire world had gone mad, that God was punishing Rome for its arrogance. Yet hope flickered each time a new pontiff took the throne, promising to restore the dignity and sanctity once associated with Peter's seat. Stephen VI's body, unlike Formosus's, received no reverential burial. It vanished into the annals of history, rumored to have been disposed of as unceremoniously as his predecessors. In the popular imagination, Stephen's name became synonymous with cruelty and sacrilege. Songs and ballads composed by wandering minstrels across Italy likened him to a demon in papal robes, whose arrogance had led to his doom. Meanwhile, the political environment beyond Rome remained as fractured as ever. Lambert of Spoleto still claimed the imperial crown. Arnulf lingered as an ailing presence in the north, though his effective influence had waned. The petty dukes and margraves of Italy jockeyed for local dominance, forming and breaking alliances as the times demanded. Each one eyed the papacy warily, recognizing that whichever man wore the tiara could legitimize an emperor or dethrone one. In that sense, Formosus's invitation to Arnulf continued to reverberate, for it underscored how pivotal the Pope's blessing could be in matters of secular rule. Yet amid all these machinations, the memory of the Cadaver Synod would not fade. It stood as a warning of how deeply political animosities could sink their teeth into the Church. Rome had been shocked into a recognition of its own vulnerability and the preciousness of its spiritual legacy. Future generations would look back on these events with a mix of horror and disbelief, struggling to understand how a city built on apostolic foundations could degrade itself through a grotesque trial of the dead. For now, Rome could only breathe a sigh of relief that the immediate crisis had passed. Stephen VI was gone, undone by the monster he had created. Formosus, though dead, was on the path to rehabilitation, and his battered body found a more respectful resting place in the Basilica of St. Peter's. The city prayed that peace, or at least respite, might follow. But in a realm so often dominated by power struggles, respite was all one could hope for. Chapter 11. Aftershocks, the pontificates of Romanus and Theodore II. With Stephen VI dead, the immediate fury that had set Rome ablaze began to subside, though tensions and intrigues persisted behind every closed door. The new pope, Romanus, stepped into a precarious situation. His pontificate, beginning late in 897, is sparsely documented, but available sources suggest he attempted to tread a path of cautious reconciliation. He avoided dwelling on the memory of Formosus publicly, likely wary that any direct contradiction of Stephen VI's acts might rekindle conflict. Instead, Romanus focused on stabilizing relations with the city's noble factions, distributing minor offices to ensure loyalty. Yet Romanus's efforts at moderation did not sit well with the die-hard supporters of Formosus, nor did they appease those who had cheered the Cadaver Synod. In an era where popes often served as lightning rods for broader political storms, Romanus found himself buffeted by competing demands. After only a few months, forces within Rome pressured him to step aside or conspired to depose him. The exact details remain murky. Some suspect that the Spoletans still pulled strings, while others blame local Roman nobles who found Romanus insufficiently pliable. Regardless, the Pope was removed. Some sources say he was forced into a monastery, and thus ended his brief, unremarkable tenure. Next came Pope Theodore II, elected in December 897. Despite ruling for only 20 days, Theodore II made a lasting mark on the Church's memory by issuing edicts that unequivocally repudiated the Cadaver Synod. He called the trial of Formosus a monstrum, a monstrous crime, and declared all of Stephen VI's decrees on the matter null and void. Theodore II ordered that the ordinations performed by Formosus be recognized as valid. This was critical to restoring stability in dioceses across Italy. For many, it was a long-awaited vindication of the deceased pope. Moreover, in a symbolic act of healing, Theodore II arranged for the recovery and reburial of Formosus's body. The accounts vary on how exactly this was achieved. Some say a group of fishermen discovered the corpse on the banks of the Tiber, guided by a miraculous light. Others credit loyal clergy with retrieving it soon after it was discarded. Regardless, the remains were brought to St. Peter's Basilica and given a proper burial with the rites befitting a pope. Theodore II, though ill and aging, recognized the necessity of this gesture to cleanse the city of the stain left by the Cadaver Synod. Rome, weary from the cycle of violence and scandal, embraced Theodore's restoration of dignity for Formosus. Bishops who had once been uncertain of their canonical status breathed a sigh of relief. Priests who had served under Formosus no longer feared condemnation. The laity, too, found solace in the idea that an injustice done to the dead pope was being reversed. But Theodore II's health gave out almost as soon as he had fulfilled this key duty. The rumors once again whispered of poison or foul play, but more likely, the strain of his advanced age and the chaotic environment took its toll. He died in January 898, leaving behind a church that was tentatively on the path to healing, yet still vulnerable to the next political tempest. In the months after Theodore II's death, the city prepared for yet another papal election, the swirl of factions continuing unabated. Each new claimant to the throne of St. Peter was scrutinized, not only for his virtues, but also for his political alliances. Throughout this frenzied process, one thing remained certain. The memory of Formosus had become a rallying cry, and the Cadaver Synod, a symbol of the Church's capacity for self-destruction when it let worldly power overshadow spiritual integrity. Nevertheless, the steps taken by Romanus, minor though they were, and especially by Theodore II, set the stage for a more formal repudiation of Stephen VI's acts. The seeds of a broader re-evaluation were sown, which would ultimately take shape under the next pontificates. Rome was desperate for a period of normalcy, yet the city's destiny seemed perpetually at the mercy of broader political currents, both within Italy and beyond. The empire, such as it was, still languished under multiple claimants and fractious noble houses. For the faithful, this era tested the very foundations of papal authority. If one pope could condemn another posthumously, and the next pope could nullify that condemnation, how stable was the Church's leadership? These questions weighed heavily on the minds of theologians and bishops alike. Yet most concluded that the Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, would ultimately transcend these dark episodes. Though men might err, the divine institution would endure. And so ended the short but meaningful reigns of Romanus and Theodore II, each a stepping stone out of the nightmare of the Cadaver Synod. The final resolution of Formosus's rehabilitation would require further papal pronouncements, yet the path to restoring his honor was now clearly marked. The shame that had marred the city's conscience was slowly being washed away, though the memory of that macabre trial could never be entirely erased. Chapter 12. The Papacy of John IX and the Official Reversal. Early in 898, John IX was elected Pope, inheriting a church that had seen 3 pontiffs in less than a year. He was a man of moderate temperament, known for his theological acumen and keen sense of diplomacy. Almost immediately, John IX took significant steps to codify the reversal of the Cadaver Synod, building upon the foundation laid by Theodore II. One of John IX's first actions was to convene a synod, somewhere between 898 and 899, where bishops from across Italy gathered to discuss the haunting legacy of the trial. They came armed with questions about the validity of ordinations, the moral implications of Stephen VI's actions, and the administrative chaos left in his wake. John IX navigated these discussions carefully, recognizing that while most bishops were eager to bury the memory of the Cadaver Synod, there were still remnants of Spolitan influence and pockets of support for Stephen VI's stance. In this council, John IX declared the Cadaver Synod an illegal assembly, convened under duress and contrary to ecclesiastical law. He reaffirmed that Formosus's papal acts were valid, thus restoring the clerical statuses of those ordained by him. This was more than a symbolic gesture. It was essential for preserving the apostolic succession in many dioceses. Had Stephen VI's decrees remained in effect, entire regions would have been left without valid bishops, precipitating a theological crisis of unprecedented scale. The synod also decreed that exhuming a body for trial was strictly forbidden, an official condemnation of the grim spectacle Rome had witnessed. John IX underscored that once a man passed into God's judgment, human tribunals had no jurisdiction. The reassertion of this principle was critical in restoring the Church's moral integrity. With these actions, John IX sought to heal the wounds inflicted by Stephen VI's vendetta. Yet the Pope also recognized the need for broader political stability. He made overtures to Lambert of Spoleto, aiming to secure a harmonious relationship. The young emperor, for his part, had grown wary of meddling further in papal affairs. The horrors of the Cadaver Synod had tarnished the Spoleto name as much as they had Stephen VI. Lambert thus showed a willingness to cooperate with John IX's efforts, at least in principle. John IX also reached out to the German territories, particularly to those who still supported Arnulf. While the East Frankish king remained weakened, the Pope was careful not to inflame tensions. After all, the Church's universal mission required maintaining cordial relations across multiple realms. No single empire now reigned supreme over Christendom, meaning the papacy had to balance allegiances to avoid being crushed between rival factions. Under John IX, Rome enjoyed a brief respite from the near-constant turmoil that had plagued it. Citizens could walk the streets without fear of seeing their religious leaders embroiled in violent upheaval. Pilgrims once again flocked to the city, taking solace that the official church had condemned the atrocity of placing a corpse on trial. Though the memory of those events still lingered like a bad dream, the faithful at least had the comfort of knowing their new pope actively sought atonement. For the clergy who had witnessed the horrors of the Cadaver Synod, John IX's reign was a breath of fresh air. Young priests, ordained by Formosus, could carry out their duties without the anxiety of being declared invalid. Bishops who had lived in fear of retribution found a pope willing to listen to their concerns. Monastic communities quietly went about transcribing the Gospels and the writings of the Church Fathers, hoping to recenter on spiritual matters rather than political vendettas. Yet even with John IX's efforts, the Roman aristocracy remained fractious. Nepotism and local rivalries did not simply vanish. The Pope had to navigate constant feuds among noble families who sought to place their favorites in positions of ecclesiastical power. John IX did so with more skill than many of his predecessors, but the seeds of conflict always lurked beneath the surface. His pontificate, though a stabilizing force, would also be relatively short. In a time when few men lived long, especially those burdened with the demands of the papacy, every year was precious. John IX's principal legacy became the institutional rejection of the Cadaver Synod and the partial restoration of normalcy in Rome's ecclesiastical affairs. Outside Italy, the scandal's echo still reverberated. The notion that the Pope of Rome could dig up a predecessor and pass judgment was a dark curiosity that overshadowed the broader Christian world. Bishops and chroniclers in distant lands recorded the event with horror as a cautionary tale. It served as a reminder that the sanctity of the papal office could be undermined by worldly entanglements and unchecked ambition. By the close of John IX's papacy in 900, Rome had achieved a fragile equilibrium. The Church, though battered by recent events, stood resilient. The name of Formosus was largely rehabilitated, and Stephen VI's memory was reviled. Yet it would not be long before new intrigues arose, for the 10th century was an age of unrelenting upheaval, and the papacy would remain a coveted prize for noble houses and ambitious men. Chapter 13. Lambert, Agiltrude, and the wider political fallout. While the Church focused on reconciling itself to the shame of the Cadaver Synod, the secular powers of Italy continued their high-stakes contest for dominance. Lambert of Spoleto, although recognized as emperor by several popes, Formosus initially, then Stephen VI, Romanus and John IX, found his authority challenged on multiple fronts. Northern Italy contained factions loyal to Arnulf, and even among the Italian nobility, Lambert's rule was often more nominal than absolute. Agiltrude, Lambert's mother, remained a powerful figure. Having once pushed so vehemently for the condemnation of Formosus, she now faced the papacy's official repudiation of the Cadaver Synod. Sources differ on how she reacted. Some suggest she grew disillusioned with Stephen VI even before his downfall, deeming him too volatile. Others claim she never fully renounced the idea that Formosus had been a traitor to Spoleto's cause. Yet the political winds shifted with each passing month. The momentum behind the Spoletan line waned as rival Italian magnates rose in influence. Margrave Adalbert II of Tuscany, Duke Guy IV of Spoleto, and other regional lords watched for opportunities to snatch territory or leverage alliances. Rome, for all its spiritual weight, was also a strategic prize, with Lambert insisting he was its rightful protector. Meanwhile, Pope John IX carefully balanced these competing interests, endorsing Lambert in theory, but maintaining lines of communication with his potential rivals. Lambert's life came to a sudden end in 898, if the chroniclers are to be believed, during a hunting accident near Marengo, in the region of Piacenza. Whether it was truly an accident or an assassination remains a matter of speculation. In medieval Italy, hunting accidents often served as convenient cover for foul play. Lambert's death marked the effective conclusion of the immediate Spoletan threat to papal autonomy. Without Lambert's leadership, the Spoleto family splintered into smaller principalities, focusing on survival rather than broad imperial ambition. Agiltrude, left without a direct foothold in imperial power, retreated to the family's base. She spent her remaining years in relative obscurity, though local chronicles suggest she continued to wield influence in Lombard and Spoletan territories. Historians differ in their assessments of her. Some cast her as a Machiavellian matriarch, orchestrating the horrors of the Cadaver Synod. Others see her as a woman protecting her son's birthright, caught in a maelstrom of shifting alliances. Regardless, her role in shaping the events that led to the trial of Formosus cannot be denied. Across Italy, nobles recalibrated their alliances in the wake of Lambert's demise. Some drifted toward alliances with the German princes, hoping to see a renewed Carolingian impetus under Louis the Child or other distant claimants. Others turned inward, consolidating local power. The concept of a unified Holy Roman Empire frayed, though it would see periodic resurgences over the coming centuries under different dynasties. For Rome, the passing of the Spolitan era meant a tenuous freedom. Popes no longer feared the immediate threat of a Spolitan army marching into the city to dictate policy. But the vacuum of external pressure also invited new internal factions to assert themselves. The Roman nobility, embodied by families like the Theophylacti, would soon rise to dominate the papal elections of the 10th century, ushering in an era sometimes referred to as the pornocracy, or the rule of Roman aristocratic women like Marozia and Theodora. In that sense, the city never truly escaped the turbulence of powerful secular lords influencing the papacy. From a broader historical viewpoint, the demise of Lambert and the fragmentation of Spolitan power illustrated how ephemeral claims to empire had become. Once Charlemagne's grand vision of a renewed Roman Empire had guided the continent. Now, less than a century after his death, the title of emperor had become a bargaining chip in local feuds, reliant on papal coronation for legitimacy, but lacking the cohesive might to enforce it across the peninsula. Thus, the political fallout of the Cadaver Synod was not confined to Rome's ecclesiastical sphere. It reverberated throughout Italy, weakening the once fearsome Spolitan presence and encouraging the city's eventual pivot toward other alliances. Pope John IX, though well-meaning, had limited power to direct these secular currents. His task was to secure Rome's spiritual integrity, a challenge daunting enough in itself. In the final analysis, the fates of Lambert and Agiltrude were woven tightly with that of Formosus. Their push to delegitimize him, culminating in the Cadaver Synod, had brought them temporary gains, ensuring the condemnation of Arnulf's coronation, but it also brought an infamy that tarnished their cause. When the Synod was overturned, their argument for supreme legitimacy likewise unraveled. Their dominion, so recently at the pinnacle of its power, faded into the fractious mosaic of Italy's city-states and margravites. Rome itself continued its uneasy journey through the 10th century, haunted by the memory of how far a pope and his allies could go to destroy the legacy of a predecessor. The episode served as a warning that the papal throne, while a seat of spiritual authority, was also entangled in the webs of secular ambition, an entanglement that, if left unchecked, could produce horrors unlike anything Christendom had seen before or since. Chapter 14. Sergius III and the Revival of Old Wounds. Despite the condemnations of the Cadaver Synod by Pope Theodore II and Pope John IX, the matter did not rest entirely in peace. In 904, Sergius III ascended to the papal throne under highly suspicious circumstances. A member of the powerful Roman aristocracy, Sergius had long harbored enmities against Formosus. Indeed, as a bishop under Pope Formosus's reign, Sergius had been implicated in earlier power struggles and had never forgiven the late pope for perceived slights. Once he became pope, Sergius III took the shocking step of reaffirming the condemnation of Formosus. Though he did not reinstate the full grotesquerie of the Cadaver Synod, he did declare the previous declarations of nullity by Theodore II and John IX invalid. Sergius thus revived old wounds and reignited controversy. His motives remain obscure. Some historians argue it was a bid to strengthen his own legitimacy by discrediting a pontiff who had overshadowed him. Others see it as a concession to powerful factions that still viewed Formosus as an interloper and favored the Spoleto alliance. Regardless, Sergius III's actions caused turmoil among the clergy once more. Priests who had relied on Theodore II's or John IX's rulings now found themselves in an uncertain canonical status again. A wave of anxiety swept through monasteries and cathedrals. Would ordinations once validated be questioned anew? Bishops once secure in their sees braced for a fresh purge. Yet the environment in Rome during Sergius III's pontificate differed from Stephen VI's era. While Sergius wielded significant power, thanks to alliances with the influential Theophylact family. He could not command the same universal acquiescence. Many bishops outside Rome flatly refused to accept a renewed condemnation of Formosus. Over the past decade, they had grown accustomed to viewing Stephen VI's synod as an aberration, a moral and theological disgrace best left in the past. Moreover, the reality of Sergius III's rule was deeply entangled with the Theophylacts, notably Theophylact I, Count of Tusculum, and his formidable wife, Theodora. Their daughter Marossia would become even more infamous in future decades. This was the dawn of a period sometimes called the Rule of the Harlots, a reference to the Theophylact women's vast control over the papal office. In such a tangled web, the condemnation of a dead pope was just one more lever of power. As a result, Sergius III's stance on Formosus never fully took hold outside Rome, and even within the city, it was regarded more as political theatrics than genuine theological conviction. In time, the issue receded from everyday concern. The condemnation technically remained on record during Sergius's reign, but few recognized it as binding. Gradually, the memory of Formosus settled into a complex tapestry of church law. For some, he was a martyred figure. For others, a cunning bishop who got entangled in the wrong alliances. For all, he was a reminder that popes were mortal men, subject to the sins and follies of their times. The efforts by Sergius III to revive the condemnation of Formosus stand as a testament to how deep personal vendettas could shape papal policy. In an era where genealogical and political ties often trumped ecclesiastical ideals, a single individual's bitterness could, for a moment, override carefully laid efforts at reconciliation. But the tide of history had already turned. Subsequent popes would either ignore Sergius's stance on Formosus or quietly reaffirm the earlier nullification of the Cadaver Synod's decrees. By the time Sergius III died in 911, the Church had moved beyond the immediate crisis of the Cadaver Synod. The 10th century, with all its tribulations, Saracen raids in southern Italy, Magyar incursions in the north, internal Roman power squabbles, would bring fresh challenges. In the grand historical arc, the trial of a dead pope remained a deeply unsettling chapter, one that illuminated how far the papacy could fall when it became a mere tool of factional strife. Thus, the saga of Formosus did not end neatly. Even in death, the man found himself embroiled in continuing disputes. Yet the broad consensus eventually settled on regarding the Cadaver Synod as a heinous miscarriage of justice. Over time, the official church position recognized Formosus as a legitimate pope, whose condemnation stemmed from the twisted politics of his day. Stephen VI and, to a lesser extent, Sergius III would bear the burden of history's condemnation for desecrating the Church's highest office in pursuit of vendettas. Chapter 15. Legacy and Reflection. In retrospect, the Cadaver Synod stands as one of the most disturbing episodes in papal history, a singular event when the quest for power ripped away the Church's veneer of sanctity, laying bare the darkest impulses of medieval politics. But beyond its immediate horror, the episode served as a cautionary tale for generations to come. Theological consequences. The Cadaver Synod raised fundamental questions about the nature of ecclesiastical authority. If a pope could be exhumed and put on trial by his successor, where did infallibility reside? The Church had long taught that while popes were men capable of sin, the Holy Spirit guided them in matters of faith and doctrine. Yet Stephen VI's actions illustrated how petty grievances could overshadow divine guidance. The fiasco laid groundwork for theologians to refine the doctrine of papal supremacy, emphasizing that a pope's spiritual authority should not be confused with personal impeccability. Moreover, the validity of sacraments ordained by a maligned pope plunged entire dioceses into chaos. The frantic attempts to undo or reinstate Formosus's acts forced bishops and canon lawyers to articulate clearer guidelines about apostolic succession, the permanence of valid ordination, and the limits of papal power to reverse sacramental rites. In many ways, the Cadaver Synod became a grim impetus for the Church to better define its procedures. Political ramifications. For secular rulers, the event underscored both the power and vulnerability of the papacy. On one hand, it showed how a determined pope could shape imperial legitimacy by crowning or condemning monarchs. On the other, it revealed how easily the papacy could be manipulated or even threatened by ambitious nobles. The disintegration of Spolitan influence and the ephemeral reign of Arnulf testified to the precarious balance between the Church and secular authority. Over the next centuries, as the Ottonian dynasty rose in Germany, future emperors took note of these events. They sought more direct control over the papal election process, eventually leading to the Ottonian Salian system of imperial protection and interference in Roman affairs. In part, the memory of the Cadaver Synod taught emperors that an unbridled papacy could create dangerous precedents. Moral and cultural impact. Culturally, the Cadaver Synod seared itself into the medieval imagination. Chroniclers recounted the macabre details for centuries, sometimes embellishing them. Horror stories about Stephen VI screaming at the corpse of Formosus became part of ecclesiastical folklore, a chilling reminder that the Christian ideal of charity could be twisted into cruelty by political ambition. Artists and poets in later centuries occasionally alluded to the Cadaver Synod as a symbol of moral corruption. In monastic scriptoria, scribes copying annals might include marginal drawings depicting the dead pope in a mock trial, a visual commentary on the dangers of hubris. The synod became a byword for the worst form of ecclesiastical scandal, invoked whenever the Church veered too close to secular entanglements. Epilogue. In the decades and centuries that followed, the Church would face many more trials, from doctrinal schisms to crusades to internal reform movements. But none would quite match the grotesque drama of a pope's corpse placed on trial. Formosus, once excommunicated and later revered, would be remembered in a complex light, both as a skilled diplomat who tried to navigate a fractured Italy, and as a victim of the darkest chapter in papal history. Stephen VI, strangled in prison, became a cautionary figure for those who sought to wield papal power as a weapon of vengeance. Rome itself, battered and unbowed, continued forward under an ever-changing cast of pontiffs, each striving in their own way to reconcile the spiritual mission of the Church with the often brutal realities of medieval politics. By the dawn of the second millennium, the Cadaver Synod had already become legend. Yet its lessons remained relevant. As the Gregorian Reform and later church councils sought to strengthen clerical celibacy, curb simony, and clarify canon law, the cautionary spectre of the Cadaver Synod loomed. It reminded the faithful that the papacy, though exalted in theory, must always guard against the corruption that springs from rivalry, ambition, and the arrogance of unchecked power. In modern times, historians, theologians, and the faithful alike still marvel at how such an event came to pass. They study it as a moment when fear, vengeance, and political machination overwhelmed the Church's moral compass. And they find in the aftermath a story of resilience. How, despite these sins, the institution did not crumble, but instead confronted its horrors, repented, and slowly worked to restore what had been lost. Thus ends the tale of the Cadaver Synod, an event so bizarre it seems stranger than fiction, yet so deeply instructive about human nature and institutional fragility that it resonates across the centuries. In the silent crypts beneath St. Peter's, and in dusty tomes of ecclesiastical law, one finds the echoes of that dark trial, and the hope that the Church, having stumbled once into the abyss, might ever after strive to remain upon firmer ground.